Chapter 45, our second chapter in this unit on ecology, entitled Population and Community Ecology. So when we talk about populations, remember that populations are a group within a particular area, all of the same species. So the term population refers to individuals in a specific area, but all of the same species. And this introduction comes in the very beginning of chapter 45.1, so we won't be looking at the entire section, but really focusing in on this first bit. Noting that it's natural for population numbers to change, to go up and down, but you don't want dramatic up and downs. So population fluctuations can occur from a number of reasons. There can be seasonal or yearly changes in the environment, which naturally cause populations to go up and down. There could be natural disasters such as forest fires and volcanic eruptions, which cause changes in population numbers. Or there could be a change in the amount of resources. So say the amount of food within a certain region, and that's going to affect the populations that live within that area. The other bit of section 45.1 is right at the end of this section, where we take a look at something called survivorship. And this is looking at a particular species and where do you see losses in the population? Are they at young ages? Are they at old ages? Or are they across the lifespan? So in this particular graph, which is called a survivorship curve, we see that there are three curves. There's this blue one, which represents survivorship type 1, and that an example of that would be humans or primates. Survivorship type 2, which is exhibited by most birds, which is in this red line, and survivorship type 3, which is in the green line, and we see demonstrated here by tree species, but also a lot of invertebrates and fish have a similar type of survivorship curve. All of these depend on the relationship between parents and offspring and how much care is given to the offspring and their ability to survive. So when we take a look at type 1, we see that over the life expectancy, we're saying the percentage of maximum life expectancy. So, if we expect humans to live until they are 100, these numbers would be 0 to 100. And we see that very young humans tend not to die until they get older, and even in midlife, we don't see much of a drop. And it's not until very, very older years where we see the numbers actually go down. So that's type 1. And also in humans, we have a lot of care in the early lifespan of the offspring. Now in type 3, we'll skip right to type 3 and then we'll go back to type 2. In type 3, we see almost a reverse curve. We see there's a dramatic loss of young organisms, and then we get to sort of midlife, and remember this is an overall life expectancy. So if this tree's life expectancy is 100 years, then we would see, by early life, maybe 15 or so, the remaining trees are going to be able to grow pretty steadily until they get into older life. If we were talking about a fish, this wouldn't be 100 years. This might be more like 5 years. And so midlife would be 2.5 years. And then we have type 2, which are the birds, and we see that there is an equal loss of individuals at a young age, a middle age, and the older age. So it's fairly consistent over the lifespan of the individuals within the population, that you lose some early on, some midlife, and then some as they get into the older life. And that has to do with the fact that birds give more care to their young than, say, fish or amphibians or trees. And then we see midlife poses some risks to these animals. And then, of course, as we get to older age, then they drop off. So now let's move on to section 45.3, and here we're only going to look at one section of 45.3, and that refers to figure 45.9, and we're looking at the growth within a population. So population size, a growth in numbers over time. So there's two main growth curves. We see exponential growth, where we have a rapidly accelerating number of individuals within the population as we go over a time period. Alternatively, we have logistic growth, where we see a slower increase at first, then we have a little bit of a speed up, but then we kind of reach the wall and we level off. And when we level off, we call that meeting carrying capacity or approaching carrying capacity. So let's go back to our exponential growth. We see this only when resources are unlimited. So resources are a limiting factor. So in this kind of growth curve, there are no limits on the resources, the food, the shelter, the other environmental characteristics that individuals need to survive. So those resources are unlimited. And so when you have exponential growth in a population, we call this a J-shaped curve, and it kind of looks like a letter J. When the resources are limited, which is most of the time, we see that populations are going to exhibit this other growth curve, this S-shaped growth curve, where we see an expansion of the population. So we see a growth expansion, but then as we start to reach where the resources are becoming more limited, so we're using up resources as these population numbers are increasing, we're going to start to level off, and we're going to have fewer and fewer because there's going to be more competition for those resources. And so we will approach, but never actually reach our carrying capacity, because if we reach our carrying capacity, then there could be a collapse of the whole population. So I wanted to include that slide because when we move on to section 45.5 and we take a look at human population growth, so now we're looking specifically at humans, we look at our growth curve for humans, and what kind of growth curve are we experiencing here? So we'll talk about this more in class, but does it look more like the J shape or does it look more like the S shape? So depending on that, you could determine, are populations living in a world where we have unlimited resources, or do we have limited resources? And this is thinking about just the human population. So what would happen if we did reach our carrying capacity? So we do notice that the blue line is a world level, so we combine everybody. And if we look at varying other countries, we see that the curve is still basically the same shape, but a little bit lower of an increase. So now if we take a look at the time period between where we have added a full billion people to the population, we can see how long it has taken. So back from when we first started recording how many people were around, we have about a billion people in the year 1800. About a billion people on the planet. And we see that it took about 130 years to add a second billion to the population. But then to add the third billion only took another 30 years. And to add the 4th billion, only 15 years. And to add the 5th billion, 12. And we've been holding steady that about every 12 or so years, we have been adding a billion people. But we do notice that as we are going forward from 2012, we see that to add our 8th billion, it's estimated that that's going to take until 2028 to add our 8th billion. That's an increase in the number of years. And to add our 9th billion, 2054. So what's happening here? And why do we see that the prediction is going up a little bit? Is it because resources are becoming more limited? Is it because we're reaching our carrying capacity? And so this is something to consider as we are looking at this population increase across the world. And what we're seeing is that we are probably decreasing the rate at which humans are having children, and therefore it's going to be, we're slowing down our population growth rate. It's taking a little bit longer for us to get to the next billion. But we're not getting anywhere near this number, this amount of time. But we are kind of leveling off a little bit from the last century. And so that's a good sign that we are slowing down the growth rate on the planet. Will we ever reach our carrying capacity? For humans, that's a good question, because we as humans are not just influenced by the natural world, but we have the ability through advancing technology to actually change the outlook for our species, and maybe we'll never reach a carrying capacity. Another interesting concept to take a look at is the age structure in different populations of humans. So we have some different graphs here, various stages. We'll take a look at those. And we see that we have males in purple, females in pink, and they're pretty much the same, males and females on either side of each individual stage. We see the youngest members of a population down lower, the oldest members towards the top of each of these figures. And we see that we start out with basically a triangular growth structure, or they call it a pyramidal, so a pyramid shape. In the very first stage, we see that this would be in an area that's undergoing rapid growth. So we see a large number of individuals way down at the bottom or the base of the structure. And then as we go up, there's kind of a rapid drop off, so that we have many individuals at the lower end and fewer individuals, and it curves upward till we get to a point where there are not very many individuals that are still alive at the peak of this structure. This is the kind of a growth age structure relationship that we would see in underdeveloped countries. Some of the third world countries in Africa and Asia would exhibit this kind of a growth representation or age representation. We move to stage 2. This is a slow growth diagram. And so here we see more that these edges of the triangle are more straightened instead of curved. And so yes, we still have a lot of individuals in the lower age brackets, but we're not losing them quite so quickly as we are in the stage 1. And we're certainly not losing as many in the middle ages as we were in the stage 1. And we have many more individuals reaching the older ages. So this would be an example of an age structure in a developed country like the United States. Then we move on to stage 3. This is a stable a stable situation where we notice we're no longer triangular. We have bulged out the middle age and the older ages to make it a more of a cone-shaped graph. And in this graph, we see that we have the number of individuals reaching the old age is approaching the same as that in the younger ages. So we see this again in developed countries that have a decrease in population growth. So we're still seeing a number of younger people here, but the number of older people is approaching the same as we see in middle ages and the younger ages. So we see this a lot in Europe, a lot of countries that have decreasing population growth. And then we get into stage 4, and this is a question mark, because look at the difference between this stage and this stage. We're kind of, it looks a lot like the stage 3 stable. It's a little higher, so older groups, but we've kind of really cut off the bottom part. Now we have fewer younger people than we do middle-aged people. And the number of younger people is definitely the same as the number of older people. So we're seeing a bulge in the middle of the age groups. And again, we're seeing this in areas where there is zero population growth, because we are seeing the same number of young people as older people. And this is happening again in a lot of countries in Europe, and some of the countries who are exhibiting zero age growth. So if we move on to the next slide, here we see a map of countries around the world where we have less than zero population growth. So these are countries in Europe, Russia, etc., which are showing fewer young people than middle-aged and older people. So they're not replacing their population. Then we move on to the gray, and here's the United States. So we would fall into that somewhat slow or even stable growth. Then we move into the growth populations of purple. That would also be a slow growth. And then we move into the yellow and the sort of pinky white color, and those would be areas of rapid growth in the some of the African countries and some of the Asian countries. The next section of this chapter, we get into interactions within communities. So we're looking at populations that are interacting within a community. So different groups of living things, different species form in a particular area, form a community. So some of these interactions involve what we call predator-prey dynamics, because some will serve as a food source, a resource for others. And this hare, which are rabbits, and lynx, which is a cat-like animal species, which is a predator for this rabbit prey group. And so we see that over time, here we have mappings of the populations of these rabbits and the populations of the lynx. And we see that anytime we have an increase in the rabbit population, we see shortly thereafter an increase in the lynx population. But then the lynx population gets high and the rabbit population goes down because the lynxes are eating all the rabbits. So then the lynx population follows with a decrease, And as the lynx population goes down, now there's not so many lynxes to eat the rabbits, and the rabbit population spikes. When the rabbit population spikes, now the lynxes have lots of rabbits to eat, and their population goes up. And we see this cycling of an increase in the prey population followed by an increase in the predator population because they're reliant on one another. They rely on one another to fuel their population growth. Another interaction within the communities are the fact that certain organisms will evolve defenses against predation or eating each other. And so these organisms will evolve certain aspects that will protect them. Some of these aspects will be very visual and outward as a warning. So for example, we have this strawberry poison dart frog, which has a very, very bright color, and that's going to warn predators that if you eat me, I'm going to make you sick. So eating these frogs will be toxic to the predator. Whereas some other species have evolved other mechanisms that will warn, again, very visual, very out there, will warn the predator to stay away, like spraying a very bad smell that these skunks do. Other animals like a porcupine will have sharp quills that they will use as a defense, and the predators will learn to stay away from those animals. Now, this is not just for the animal populations, but plants use these also. So plants can have outward warnings like thorns that predators should stay away and not eat them. They also have some bad tastes that animals, once they eat them, will learn, I should stay away from this plant. Now, not all defenses are something that will harm the animal. Sometimes the defenses are by allowing an animal to hide behind another animal that does have one of those outward facing defenses. So for example, in Batesian mimicry, here we have a bee which does have a painful sting if another animal tries to attack it. Now this animal over here is actually a robber fly, and the robber fly is not a bee, it's a fly, but it looks a whole lot like the bee. And so animals that have learned to stay away from bees will also stay away from the robber fly. And so the robber fly gets credit for the predation mechanism that the bees have developed. Additionally, this defense is that several species may exhibit what's called Mullerian mimicry, where you have a number of species that all look similar to one another, but they have varying amounts of their defense. So all of these butterflies to some degree taste bad. Some may taste worse than others. So if you were a predator, maybe you could eat this one and it wouldn't really taste that bad, but this one would taste really bad. But because their coloration is all pretty much the same, predators have a hard time telling the difference between them. And so they'll basically stay away from the whole lot of them. And therefore, all of these individual species, these are not one group, these are individual species, will benefit from the fact that predators will learn that it's not good to eat these particular colorations. All right, our next topic is called competitive exclusion principle within a community. And this says that within a community, two species cannot occupy the same niche or the same role in any habitat. So if two species live in the same area, they can't fill the same role within that habitat because they're going to use the same resources. And therefore, one of them is not going to succeed because they're both going to be competing for the same resources. So here we have three graphs, 1, 2, and 3. In graph A, we have a particular species of paramecium. Remember that paramecium are ciliated protists, so they're single-celled protists. And when you culture these protists with a particular medium that they really like to eat, you notice that over time, over a 20-day period, these animals will increase. So we're looking at their population growth. They'll be very happy. So this is this type of paramecium, the Aurelia alone. But if you then culture the same paramecium caudatum, again alone, in the same medium, they'll be very happily growing. But if you then culture them together, put some of these guys in with some of these guys in that same medium that they like, you'll notice that the Aurelia species will go about its growth just like it did before, but the caudatum will not, because the Aurelium will win out. And so when you have the competitive exclusion principle, if you have two species that live in the same area, one's going to win out over the other. They are going to compete for the resources. One's going to win, one's going to lose. So species need to find their own niches in the same habitat. If they're going to live in the same area, they're going to have to find something different that will help them to survive. The next thing I'd like to talk about is symbiosis, or living together. So here is an interaction that individuals of different species have evolved over time in order to live together. So symbiosis means living together. There are 3 different ways that species can live together. Commensal relationship means that one species is going to benefit from the living together, while the other species is just neither benefiting or is it harmed in any way. It just kind of goes about its business. And we'll have some examples of that coming up in a slide. Mutualism is when the 2 species live together and they both benefit from the interaction. Parasitism, this is when one species benefits and the other species is actually harmed. So it does not do well. So here from our textbook, we see that when birds build nests in the trees, so now we have birds living with trees, 2 different species, the bird is benefiting from the situation because it's up off the ground, it's away from predators, it is benefiting, but the tree is neither benefits nor is harmed. So that's a commensal relationship. Another example, and you may have heard of this one, is the clownfish and the sea anemone, where the clownfish lives inside of a sea anemone which has stinging tentacles. The clownfish does not get harmed by the stinging tentacles and is actually benefits because that helps keep its predators away from it. It kind of can hide out in the sea anemone. But the sea anemone neither benefits nor is harmed by the clownfish hanging out within its tentacles. Here we have example of mutualistic relationship. So this is a species of termite. Within the termite lives a protozoa. This is a protist, and within the protist lives a bacteria. So those 2 species, the 2 species, hang out inside the termite species, and they help. The termite will eat wood. The protist with the bacteria inside is able to digest the wood where the termite can't. And so the energy that comes from the wood, the cellulose, is then the protist gets some of the energy, the bacteria gets some of the energy, and the termite gets some of the energy. Everybody benefits. Here we have a picture of a lichen. Remember, a lichen is a fungus that lives with either a green algae or a cyanobacteria inside its cells. And so here, the cyanobacteria or the green algae can photosynthesize and produce food that the lichen can use. The fungus can't make its own food. And the fungus provides a home for the algae or the cyanobacteria to live. And then lastly, parasitism, and here we see a tapeworm, which is a member of the phylum Platyhelminthes. So this is an animal which will live inside of the digestive tract of a number of different species, pigs, humans, etc. And it's literally going to rob these hosts of the food that it needs. And so therefore, this tapeworm is a parasite living inside of a host and is causing harm to its host. We now are going to look at relationships within the community or the building of a community. So we have what's called a foundation species. These are one or more species that have the greatest effect on the overall structure of all the living things in that area. So they form the base of that community. They are oftentimes the primary producers. So a primary producer are the organisms that are able to make food. So here in this picture, we see that this is actually a coral reef. And the coral reef, the organisms of the coral, they are not themselves the primary producers, but they provide homes for the algae and the dinoflagellates that are the primary producers. But they provide the home on which so many other organisms can live. So the coral is considered a foundation species of the coral reef ecosystems. We then also have what are called keystone species. Now, keystone species are species that keep the growth numbers of the other organisms in check. So they're often a secondary predator within a particular ecosystem, so they make sure that the numbers of the primary consumers are going to stay not going out of control. So for example, here we have a sea star, which is a keystone species, and it's going to consume mussels, which are primary consumers. The mussels are going to eat algae, etc. And we don't want the primary consumers to get out of control in numbers. So these sea stars are going to keep their numbers in check. So they help to maintain the ecosystem. Now, a keystone in a building is one of the particular structural elements in the architecture that keeps the building from falling down. So that's why we call this a keystone species. It keeps the whole area in check. And then we have invasive species. Invasive species we've talked about a little bit. They can be plants, they can be animals, and these are non-native species that move into an area and they cause much concern because they disrupt the balance in the community. They are able to come in and they compete with native species for resources, and they are often more well adapted to lots of different areas, and so they can cause a lot of trouble. Now, the last part of 45.6 involves community dynamics. So we have an example of what is called succession. So this is the appearance or disappearance, the going away of species in a community over time. So when we have something called primary succession, this happens when there's newly formed land. For example, when a volcano erupts and there's new land produced. And so then we need to colonize the land by living things. The very first species to colonize new land is called a pioneer species, and that's the first to establish communities. It's often algae and lichens that come in to colonize initially, and then other species will move in later. It takes a really long time. Now, secondary succession is when you have an established ecosystem, like an oak and a hickory forest, that then gets disturbed. Say the oak and the hickory forest completely burn down in a fire, and we need to rebuild this ecosystem. So we have to start all over again, and that's what's shown in this diagram. We're going to rebuild through secondary succession the oak and hickory forest. So first we have to bring back in the pioneer species, the very first species. Even though this isn't brand new land, it was destroyed in the fire, so we have to rebuild it, and then we're going to then go in to add in some annual species, maybe some grasses, and then we move into perennials. Then we can move in and add shrubs and then pines, and we can get some young oak trees to grow. And then finally, when we completely reestablish the forest with oak and hickory trees, we have what's called the climax. So you reach the very top, the climax community. You get back to where you were. This whole process is going to take about 150 years, where this process here could take much longer, hundreds of years to even 1,000 years. The last section of this chapter is looking at innate behaviors, and I've just picked out a few of them. We're going to look at innate behaviors versus learned behaviors. So innate behaviors means these are things you are born with. They are coded for in your genetics. So we call these often a reflex or an involuntary or a rapid response to a stimulus. You may have experienced this yourself when you've gone for a physical exam and you sit on the doctor's table and you get tapped on the knee with a little hammer and your leg jerks out. That's an involuntary or rapid response. That's nothing you thought about. Some of these reflexes, kinesis, is when there's a movement and it's in any direction in response to a stimulus. Kinesis means movement. Whereas taxis means there's a directed movement away from a stimulus. So if you shine a light on a dish of little protists, they will move away from the light. We then have some innate behaviors. Again, remember, inborn, nothing learned, called migration. These are long-range seasonal movement of animals. Obligate migration, the animals always migrate. They're always going to move from one area to another. An example is the monarch butterfly might move from the northern parts of North America all the way to Mexico. The lesser long-nosed bat will move from California in the summer to more like Mexico area, South Central America in the winter. So this is a seasonal movement. Also, we have facultative migration. These animals may choose to migrate or may not migrate. It could depend on the resources. So, example, the snowy owl may move in winter from Canada down to the New England area. And we see these often on the beaches of New Hampshire because there may not be enough resources for them in winter in Canada. Another innate behavior is foraging. So this is the act of searching for food. This is built into the DNA to search out food sources. And courtship displays. So these are visual behaviors to attract mates. Again, baked into the genetics. They may involve multiple alternating steps of behavior. And if not done correctly, then the mating may not be successful. The female, if this is done, there's say a ritual dance that's done by a male and say a male bird, and it's not done correctly, then the female may not be willing to mate with that male. So here's some examples of migration, the movement of these wildebeests in search of rain-ripened grass. Here's foraging examples, looking for food. These are all innate behaviors. And the courtship display, often shown by birds, but also insects do a lot of courtship display, and reptiles. And then the very last bit of this chapter is I've picked out one learned behavior. So this is not something baked into the genetics. This is something that occurs very early. So in a very, very young animal, and we see it in a lot of birds, where the very first individual they see, they decide is their mother. And they will latch on to this mother and follow her. And this helps improve survival in the wild. So if you think about Darwin's survival of the fittest, why do traits persist? Well, the birds that imprint on their mother are more likely to survive. Hence, they will survive and then be able to reproduce later. So that behavior becomes something that works well as a learned behavior. And here I have posted a book, Are You My Mother? It's a Dr. Seuss book that you may have read as a child that shows this bird who doesn't see his or her mother right off because the mother, after lays the eggs, goes to look for food sources, and the little bird hatches and goes in search of her mother, and so is asking all kinds of different animals, are you my mother? So this is an example of imprinting, which is a learned behavior. And that will finish our chapter 45.